Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Good evening. Thank you so much for having me. It's 3 o'clock at home in the morning, so bear with me. I said by the time I finally figure myself out of this jet lag, I'm on my way back home, which is on Monday. So the symposium is looking at advancing education in Muslim societies. And it wasn't too hard for me to think about an appropriate keynote. And so I want you to come to this keynote and accept it as a challenge and not as an indictment. I want you to listen attentively and consider, is she possibly onto something, and not automatically become defensive, which is what we automatically do, I think. So I want to start with the premise that while we talk about advancing education in Muslim societies, I think we need to maybe dig a bit deeper and recognize that we are actually in crisis at the moment. So that's my point of departure. So not too alarmist, but let me talk you through it. So it's not, okay, there we are. So it's important when we reflect on where we are now to look back on where we have come from. Now, Muslim education, Islamic philosophy enjoys an incredibly rich history. It precedes the great philosophers that we often draw upon, like Aristotle and Plato and Socrates. It really has an immensely rich history. And for a very good reason, there was a period called the Islamic Golden Age, where all kinds of philosophies and mathematics and critical thinking and engagement was really a profound part of what it meant to be a scholar in Islam. And so it might be, my screen is not showing, I'm not quite sure why, but let me carry on. So it might help you to know that if you talk to the Western world, for example, then they will say to you that Europe is the home of the world's first university. But actually, Islam has the world's first university. The very first one was established in 895 CE in Morocco, and notably by a woman. And this is really important. So a woman started it, and at this particular university in Fez in Morocco, you had amazing scholars who were teaching. People like Al-Idrisi, Ibn al-Khaldun, Ibn al-Arabi. I mean, these were phenomenal scholars. And so we have this very incredibly rich history of amazing research. But critically, what I want to point out immediately, that these philosophers, these Islamic scholars, were never only interested in Islam. From the outset, there was a very clear understanding that if you want to be in this world, and if you want to contribute to this world, then you have to find a way not only to expand your Islamic knowledge, but you have to understand the world you are in. And this is a critical point, especially as we look at what's happening in the world around us. So we have this incredibly rich history, and then something happened. And maybe because we started so high, we could only go down. And there was this stagnation. And more Islamic Muslim institutions became known as places of authoritarianism, indoctrination, memorization, rote learning, no room for critical thinking, no room for interrogation, no room for consultation, no room for deliberation, which is incredibly problematic if you consider the fact that if we are laying claim to Muslim education, then the very basis of that education ought to be deliberative. It ought to be based on democratic principles. Let me immediately just clarify also, because people often think that Islam is irreconcilable with democracy. I want to immediately disabuse you of that myth. Islam is completely embedded in democratic principles. It's Muslims who have not done a proper job of honoring that message. So then we saw a glimmer of hope in 2011, 2010, with the horrific self-emulation of Mohammed Bouazizi in Tunisia. You might remember him as a hawker whose Apple card got confiscated, and in absolute desperation, because that was the last bit of livelihood he had left, he literally set himself alight. And that ignited the Arab Spring. And I was hopeful. I was incredibly hopeful that finally the youth had had enough. They were tired of being oppressed and shut down and silenced by insecure, dictatorial, authoritarian regimes. Unfortunately, it didn't amount to much. It's very hard standing up to political systems. And all the while this is happening, while people like Mohammed Bouazizi are setting themselves alight and subsequently died, the question that I had since then is, where are our universities? Where are these higher education systems of excellence that we purport are so great, that have come from such a rich legacy? Where are the voices of our academics? What's happening? And so what I want to take you to, and so we had this hope, and unfortunately it amounted to nothing. Now, to just contextualize more for you, the reason why I say to you that we are in crisis is because on the one hand, despite the fact that we have many universities in Muslim majority countries, we are nowhere in the top world rankings. We are not producing the kinds of scholarship that our predecessors were known for. We're not producing any scientific breakthroughs. We're not producing anything new. So on the one side, you can quantify the stagnation, because whether we like it or not, universities are ranked. It matters what kinds of knowledge we produce, and it's not evident. But that might be of a lesser concern if you consider the other big crisis, which I think is a bigger one, which is this absolute paralysis when it comes to addressing the condition, not only of Muslims, because the Quran was never sent for Muslims. It was sent to all of humanity. So this idea that we only have to take care of ourselves is another myth. And so we have this crisis of the world around us is changing all the time. We are in the midst of neocolonialism, of racism. Ilham and I had the most extraordinary time yesterday when we visited the African American Museum, and you move from the lowest dungeon section where the slave exhibitions are to the top where Black Lives Matter is. And once you get to the top, you have to realize, so what has changed? What has changed? Okay, so for Muslims, the biggest crisis at the moment, we would like to call Islamophobia. But of course, Islamophobia is nothing else but racism. It's a very simple thing. It's nothing special. Islam, and again, this is not something new. Islamophobia has always existed in one form or another through colonialism, because colonialism refused to accept Islam as a religion. It saw it as an ideology, right? And it could be disposed of. And so Islamophobia is not new. And yet we find ourselves in a world right now where I know as a Muslim woman, when I travel, you've got to be careful how you navigate spaces, because you never quite know when you're going to be confronted, right? When you're going to be held back, when your passport gets taken away for a bit too long, you're not quite sure what's happening. These are confrontations. And at the center of this confrontation is what I want to refer to, and this is because this is my absolute passion. And it cuts across citizenship education, and it cuts across what it means, anything about social justice, and it cuts across ironically, democracy. So this thing it's not called, I call it specifically Muslim women's bodies, because there's a certain kind of detachment that happens in the treatment of Muslim women. They are not seen to be as with agency. Muslim women are not seen to be autonomous beings. You put on a hijab and immediately you must be backward, you must be passive, you must be uneducated, right? And as I get asked by colleagues sometimes, does your husband make you wear that? As if I do not have a mind of my own. So, and this entire dichotomy gets constructed. And so we get pulled, and Sheila bin Habib, one of my favorite theorists, talks about the fact that the women's body becomes a site of symbolic conflict. Now, here's the irony, and why I bring her up at this point, is that not only is she the site of conflict in liberal democracies, but she's also the site of conflict in Muslim countries. And so she gets used for different purposes. The body gets used because neither sees her as an autonomous being. So liberal democracies say to her, let us liberate you. Come, we will liberate you by removing your hijab, and then you will be free. And then normative Islam says, no, 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 let's clothe you so that you can remain the custodian of Islamic values. So this piece of cloth that I have, a thin, cheap little cloth, but it carries a tremendous symbolic power. And depending on how you navigate and where you go, you will be tugged in these directions. So Muslim women sits at the center. And here again, this is not new. Colonialism has always done this. Frans Fanon is known to have said, if you want to conquer a society, what do? You go for the woman. You go for the woman. That's how you change society. And we see the exact same thing now. And of course, for me, it was tragically exemplified in the brutal murder of Masha. Sorry, I forget her surname. Masha Amini. And so we have this collision of Islamophobia, and you have this collision of the treatment of Muslim women. And of course, Muslim women then carries both. She embodies both, right? She is trapped in both. And whether she's sitting in liberal democracy, so a private decision to veil becomes a matter of public debate. And this is where we are at right now. And so, as I said to you earlier on, I'm watching with bated breath what's happening in Iran right now. So we find ourselves, quite ironically, and again, if we talk about Muslim education, the entire purpose of the Quran is, of course, on the one hand, a theological text. On the other hand, it's a book of guidance. It's a book of ethics. It's a legal text. But fundamentally, it has a message. And the message of the Quran is to take one from darkness into light. That's the whole point of it. To move from a state of not knowing to a state of knowing, which is why the very first injunction given to our Prophet ﷺ, which was, peace be upon him, which was to read. It could have been absolutely anything, right? It could have been submit, it could have been believe, but he was told to read. And that injunction has been followed through upon generation. And there's a reason for that, because there's such a tremendous emphasis on seeking education, understanding. And the Quran itself is a very critical text, because the Quran differentiates between people who know and those who don't know. And the Quran poses questions and says, will you not ponder upon yourself? Will you not reflect upon what you believe? So nowhere is there this idea of passivity of learning, that I merely absorb what is given to me, that I don't ask questions. Our very texts that we so much lean on, that we consider as our foundation, invites us into critical engagement at every single turn. Yet, when you compare that message with what is happening, not only in higher education, but in our schools, it's the complete opposite. It's the complete opposite. Where children sit and die of boredom, and I really hope you aren't at this point. And they are merely given information, and teachers are too ill-equipped to even be able to answer the question. And this is the state of Muslim education. And it's not just in Muslim majority countries, it's in my home country as well, where there's a strong emphasis on rote learning, and you do as I say. And if the question comes, well, because I say so. You're not answering the question, which is why our young people are in such crisis. Because you are not providing them with the answers. You are not equipping them with the tools of how to navigate an increasingly changing world, and for Muslim women in particular, an increasingly hostile world. Right, so now we have the darkness. And so the questions that I have, is there any sense of the crisis that we are in? And I fear not. Do we even recognize as Muslims that we are still in darkness? And I sense not. And this is the fear that I have. So what I want to offer is that I want us to think about what we ought to have in mind when we talk about Muslim higher education. I want us to consider what is possible, and also I immediately want to point out, it's not only Muslim higher education or universities in Muslim societies which are struggling, right? There are many universities who play absolutely no role in relation to the society in which they find themselves. So this is not a criticism which is unique to Muslim institutions. Right? In my own institution, there are endless battles of what is the purpose of education if you are not changing the society in which you find yourself. Because ultimately, if your education is of no benefit to anybody else, then what is the point? What is the point? Quite just very straightforwardly. And so we have this idea that there has to be a goal. And the first thing that Muslim higher education has to become cognizant of in a very renewed way is the fact that it has a moral responsibility. And I fear that currently higher education institutions have not taken ownership of that responsibility. We see higher education, we see the purposes of university as the churning out of graduates and the churning out of degrees. But what it should be doing is producing a particular kind of person. So there's been many responses. I'm not the first one to raise concerns about the crisis in higher education. So let me just take you through that. So one of the more popular responses that we have had is this idea of Islamization of knowledge. So this idea of if we actually remove the bifurcation of knowledge and we combine the rational sciences and we combine the secular sciences with your rational and your irrational, and we combine knowledge and we permeate all knowledge within an Islamic ethos, then we will achieve something. So people like Al-Faruqi was key in that, Fazlur Rahman was key in that, Abu Sulaiman was key in that, and of course, the Malaysian scholar Naguib Alatas was also key on that. So this idea that if we Islamize the knowledge that we produce, we will be better prepared to navigate an ever-changing society. Now, unfortunately, theoretically, it possibly has an argument, but in practice, Islamization has not taken off. So the best example it possibly has taken root would be your Islamic University in Malaysia. In South Africa, we've also tried it in our Muslim-based schools, but it hasn't worked because what's happened in South Africa, for example, they teach the core curriculum, which is the state curriculum, and then they supplement the core curriculum with a few Arabic classes and fiqh classes, and then they say, oh, we've Islamized the curriculum. But of course, that's not what Islamization is. And then after 9/11, because education is always politicized, there is no such thing as an apolitical education system. America's system is politicized, South Africa's politicized. After 9/11, we saw a demise almost of Islamization of knowledge. And in came this new term called integration. None of this has worked. None of this has worked. Because fundamentally, we continue to miss the point, which is that education needs to have a purpose. And we ought to accept from the outset, and I don't know why we even bother to talk about secular knowledge or spiritual knowledge. I don't know why we do this to ourselves, when every bit of knowledge you and I have is God-given to begin with. Right? You want to study trees, guess who made the tree? So every single thing we do is already embedded in a kind of divine creation. So there's no need for us to quibble about secular knowledge and non-secular knowledge. So Islamization has not taken off in the way that it has. And so there has been numerous attempts, and we saw numerous conferences being held. And again, nothing has come of it, because we still are sitting. And if you're questioning my very persistent argument that we are in a crisis, if you're wondering whether I'm right, it's okay for you to wonder. You can disagree with me about that as well. Okay? But that doesn't remove from us the responsibility to question our universities. And I'm afraid from where I'm standing, when I look at the MENA region, if I look at our liberal democracies where we also have Muslim institutions, then I'm afraid to say we have not addressed the current crisis of today. Now, what am I talking about? So in addition to Islamophobia, we have a world that's completely in flux at the moment, right? Civil war, unrest, wars, right? Poverty. People are displaced. So you have people in perpetual motion all the time. You have people don't want to leave their homes. Nobody wants to give up their home. Nobody. People leave their homes because they don't have a choice. Okay, when people schlep from African countries into South Africa with only the bag on their back, it's not because they want to. They know they're going to have a hard time coming into South Africa. It's because they have no choice. But our universities have not offered any response to the modern day calamities that we have. Our particularly, and I'm very critical right now, I know, of our Muslim Institute, but hey, it's advancing Muslim education, isn't it? So this is why the focus is Muslim education. Our Muslim institutions have not done that. And that's because our Muslim institutions have not understood that the imperative of education is directly linked to God. They don't get that. Let me explain why. So often when we are confronted with Islamophobia, often when we're confronted with immigration and displacement, and Muslims are suffering, we seem to think that if we just offer people an Islamic response, they will better understand us. People often say, oh, if they just knew about Islam, if they just understood what we actually believed in, that's not going to help us. That's not a legitimate response. We've got to find a different kind of language through which to respond to the world in which we find ourselves. And we have not yet refined that language. So I'm going to try and help us do that. And so the first thing is, I've deliberately called this about reimagining and returning. And the reason why I'm saying returning is because we had it. We had it at one point. We had exemplary scholars. We had scholars who were able to study philosophies and logic and mathematics and the world around them and combine that with Islamic knowledge and offer us powerful responses. So we need to get back, partly we need to get back to that kind of scholarship. I'm not saying go back in history because we can't do that. I'm saying we need to go back to that kind of scholarship where people understand the absolute necessity of seeking knowledge, and not just Islamic knowledge, all kinds of knowledge. And so the return is to that. But the language that we need needs to be a language which can speak to this kind of world that we find ourselves in. And this kind of world is a world that is completely out of sync at the moment. We are in turmoil as a ummah. And I use the word ummah. People think ummah is only meant for my Muslim brothers and sisters. But the Quran uses the term probably over 90 times, in different ways. And fundamentally, it's about a global community. You and I are connected by virtue of the fact that we come from the same being. It's as simple as that. And so we have to be able to respond to that. And so what I make an argument for is this idea of taking responsibility on the one hand. And when I say take responsibility, it's about being responsible for each other. So when I'm a teacher, like I am at my university, I have to take responsibility for everybody in my class. If somebody's not coming to my class regularly, I've got to ask, where have you been? Because I care about you and I'm concerned about your well-being and about your future. I take responsibility for you. But I also have to take responsibility in preparing you for the world out there. Now, that means that I've got to give you a language that's going to allow you to navigate this increasingly changing world that we find ourselves in. So, I actually need my glasses. 1 second, sorry.
Take mine.
No, I don't think that's going to work. I think that's going to. This is what happens with age, yeah. So, one of the things that the idea of taking responsibility is also about being responsive, right? So it's not just a matter of teaching. It's about teaching in a way which is responsive to the world in which you find yourselves. And then one of the first things that I'm calling upon Muslim education centers, institutes, universities to do is to take responsibility for those they teach, equipping them for the world in which they find themselves, but to teach them in such a way that you are preparing them to be able to respond to the world that we are in. So we have lots of challenges coming our way at the moment, right? And so this is key for me. And you will notice that very clearly here, it's about responding to the challenges and malaises and the crises in which we find ourselves. Because education is not simply about teaching people about a particular subject. Education has to do with preparing young people how to be in the world in which they find themselves. So we cannot hold on to particular teachings and traditions which worked 50 years ago and expect our young people to be able to function in this world. And this is why you've got to ask yourself, why are so many young people in a state of crisis? Why are so many young people struggling with mental health? Because we are not adequately preparing our young people for how to be in this world. The other thing that we need is that Muslim education, for some reason, is afraid of this word or this process of critical inquiry. There seems to be an aversion to any, and I know where I am now in the US, the issue of critical thinking, critical race theory, I know that's a bugbear right now. For the life of me, I cannot understand how you can teach any child in any society and not talk about critical race theory, but hey, here we are in a democracy. And so immediately I want to say to you, and maybe this makes you feel better, that this crisis that I'm describing, it's not just Muslim institutions, right? The idea of shutting down debate, it's seeping into our most liberal institutions. And it seems to me that liberalism is only prepared to tolerate liberalism and is not prepared to tolerate any views they consider to be inappropriate. And so this pattern of academic disinvitation, I'm sure you've heard of it. We invite you and then we disinvite you because we don't like what you're going to say. It's censorship. It's censorship. That's what it is. And shutting down ideas, whether we like it or not, because you are saying something I don't like, when you shut that down, you are killing academic freedom. And so this criticism is not just leveled, but let's face it, at Muslim institutions, if you don't say what they want you to say, you will be disinvited. In fact, by now the plug would have been pulled on me, right? So critical inquiry, unless we are able to reflect upon ourselves and actually notice the blinkers and take note of our biases, because we all have it, including myself, we cannot change, right? And this idea of echo chambers, where we surround ourselves with people who think like us and who say the same things like us, simply means we will never be challenged. And so universities have to be spaces where you are challenged, where you are absolutely disrupted out of your comfort zone. And if universities are not doing that, if they are not disrupting you and provoking you and irritating you, then I'm failing in my teaching, right? So when I teach my philosophy class, it's all about disrupting thinking, because I have to get you to think about what you know and then to get you to think about what you don't know. So critical inquiry is really important. The next point is that there has to be a very clear understanding, and this comes from Jacques Derrida's work, where he talks about the fact that universities can not only be concerned about the academic project. That universities have responsibilities which extend beyond the walls of the university. That universities have to have an impact on society. And again, so if we look at the universities that we have in our different Muslim majority countries, what good have they brought to communities? Of what benefit have they been to the poor? Of what benefit have they been to people who are displaced? How have they assisted the cultivation of a better society? And if they haven't done that, if education does not have a purpose beyond this roof, we are all wasting our time. Okay? And so in returning and reimagining, I want to just draw on the works of Ron Barnett, who talks about the fact that within a university, there are 4 key areas that a university has to be aware of. The one is we've got to accept that this world is unpredictable, right? Did we, any of us foresee COVID? No. None of us could have seen how the world would have changed in a split second. So we have to recognize that in as much as we are teaching for something, we're also teaching for the unknown. And this is important because we cannot know what we are teaching for. The next point he talks about is uncertainty. This is a very important point because I think academics and teachers sometimes become too certain in their knowledge. They think they know their discipline. I know what I'm doing. But part of being a good teacher is to doubt. Part of being a good teacher is to actually say, I'm not sure. Because that's when the learning happens. That's the power. And when I can say that to my students, then the trust will evolve even more because my students will then want to learn with me. The third point he talks about is the contestability, that we have to question the world in which we find ourselves. We have to question why Islamophobia has become just something Muslims have to accept. We have to question why women, and let's take the Muslim out of it, but why the public domain is so different for women to access. Why it's so incredibly different when a male accesses the public domain, it's entirely different to how a woman. We have to question patriarchy. We have to question misogynist behavior. We have to bring into disrepute certain taken for granted norms. And for Islam, for those who claim to be Muslim, we have to seriously question the way we have allowed Muslim women to be at the forefront of Islamophobia. It's everyone who claims to be Muslim and not. Because the fact that a particular group is called out on the basis of how she dresses should concern any socially just human being. It should be a matter of concern to anybody because it's a form of discrimination. And then the last one that Barnett talks about is the fact that we need to challenge our own understandings. And here again, if we look at the interpretations of Islam, if you look at what led to the model police, as they are called in Iran, why is there such a thing like a model police? Why do we need to police morality? The mere fact that we have to police morality means that we're already in trouble, aren't we? Because morality can't be policed. You don't know what I'm up to behind closed doors. So how do you police that? Yet it's a part of our society. We have to challenge these norms. We have to ask ourselves why we continually just abide by these things. And this is where the role of the university comes into play in a most profound way. We can't talk about higher education if we're not evolving and becoming more informed as human beings. And then finally, in as much as what I've said pertains to probably more to Muslim institutions, because that's the focus of my talk, as well as the conference. But the additional thing for Muslim universities is that if you are going to lay claim to being an institution of Islam, and if you're going to lay claim to being a Muslim education institution, then you cannot remove the ethical load and burden which comes from what you are doing. And so in Islam, we are taught that we are representatives of God, right? We are the vicegerents or vice-regents, however you want to say it. And what that means is that we become the embodiment of God's creation, and we begin to reflect His knowledge, and we begin to reflect His creation. And ultimately, what we should be doing, the whole purpose, according to the Quran, of what we are meant to be doing as Muslims is to get to a state of harmony and beauty with our creation. That's the point of what we ought to be doing. Every single thing we are doing is supposed to be in harmony. And if we look upon the Muslim world right now, there isn't much harmony. Isn't there? Or is there? Am I mistaken? I don't think so. Right? There is very little room where we can talk about harmonious coexistence. There's very little room where we can talk about agreement. There's this discord all the time. And it's harming not only Muslims, but it's harming the message which we ought to have been carrying over by virtue of the fact that we said, I've accepted the message of Islam. So there's a strong, very, very strong religious base attached here. And my fear is that it's fine to lay claim to saying you're a Muslim education institution. But then remember, if you're going to make that claim, the burden of responsibility increases. Thank you so much. Ilham, if you want to.
We actually have about 30 people online, and some of them are writing comments, but we don't see questions yet unless someone here in the audience has a question. You have one online? Okay, and then I have one.
Okay.
But we'll start online. Okay, so can everyone hear me? All right. So this is from Michael Gibbons, who is our scholar in residence here in the ITEP program. He writes, there is an eerie similarity between the failure of Western secular education to foster the founding principles of forming a free, critical thinking, democratic, and pluralistic citizens, and B, the shortcomings of Islamic education to foster the critical self-reflection and dialectical reasoning of Muslims at the heart of the Holy Quran's guiding questions. Here are your questions. What do you think of this eerie similarity and its implications for education reform that is a catalyst for resistance, responsibility, critical inquiry in the 21st century across the world? And two, can the reimagining and returning in Islamic education that you propose point the way forward for a regenerative, diverse global community on a fragile planet? So the big questions.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. I believe that if you don't have to tie a religious framework to it, right? And he's quite right in drawing the correlations and saying it's the exact same thing, which is actually so ironic, actually, if you think about it, because we always kind of have this, Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. And here Michael draws attention to the fact that actually the crisis is exactly the same. But I believe that if we get back to what the purpose of education is, and I think that's at the heart of it for me. And this is part of a bigger picture because we are part of a globalized, commodified, marketized world where education is increasingly becoming a commodity. And we kind of think it's about getting paperwork, and we associate education with economic prosperity and mobility. We seldom think about it as a kind of model compass and in terms of what I can do to create a better society. And I think that's at the heart of it for me, that we have lost sight of the fact that education is the only means towards a more socially just society. But if you're going to have curricula being targeted in the way that it is in a liberal democracy like the US right now, where if you're going to take out critical race theory as an example, if you're not going to equip children to think critically, then you can forget about creating a more socially just society. Now, the other big issue for me tied to that is how we understand education. Because together with understanding education only as a means to an end, the other big issue is that we have prioritized the wrong subjects. that we have placed a very strong emphasis on STEM. We have told people that if you want to achieve, do maths and engineering. And we have told them, again, it's about money, isn't it? Your son wants to do BA and you go, oh my word, I can't support you all my life because a BA is not going to amount to anything. But what we are missing in that is that part of teaching children how to think critically, part of democratic principles, it's not just about how to think critically, it's about instilling compassion and care and respect and regard and mutual trust. And we don't have that anymore. And what it means to live in a peaceful way with another human being. And our education system is not doing that. And so a very profound example would be when the world got hit with the pandemic and it affected us all in the same way. In other words, we all became ill if we got the virus, and unfortunately, millions died. What did this world do? This world said, oh, no. So we're going to keep the vaccinations and get 4 shots, while beyond the sea, other countries are saying, can we please get 1 shot? And that to me was a very revealing aspect of just how removed we are from each other's humanity. So education has to come back to the rehumanization project, and we have forgotten that. And if we talk about instilling democratic principles, it's not just about the right to vote. It's got to do with what does it mean to be a good human being. Yeah, I hope I've answered my point.
Should I ask? Yeah. So one of the things you said is the phenomena of disinvited,
Yeah.
And I just want to expand on that and add a layer of complexity that you haven't talked about, and I know it's maybe not the subject of your talk, but we cannot talk about academia and critical thinking and MENA and Arab Spring without talking about repressive regimes and people who don't want you to even think critically, who are in power. So how does that play a role in how we teach at universities? I know from the Palestinian experience that faculty at universities are not necessarily allowed to teach what they want and what they think is good citizenship, democratic citizenship is all about. And that's just one example of many others. So how do you see that playing a role with all what you talked about?
I'm very aware of the fact that in many instances, faculty members are not at liberty to teach what they want. I'm aware that they are regulated, they could lose their job or worse. That does not take away the responsibility. You have to continually push. Even at my own university, there are certain paradigms I'm not allowed to go into, but you have to take the risk. Education has to involve risk. If South Africans, for example, simply sat back and accepted what was happening to us during apartheid, we would still be in apartheid state. And again, this talks to bravery, this talks to courage, but the more you can mobilize people, the more people you can get to do this, the more you can push. And here I'm afraid that academics do have that responsibility. Academics have to see themselves, for me, being an academic also means being an activist. You have to make your education and your knowledge be actionable. It's got to make a difference. So the idea of this invitation happened in South Africa as well, I must tell you. South Africa prides itself on having the world's most liberal constitution, by the way, right? And even at our universities, there was a case where somebody was invited and the student said, no, we don't want him to come speak on the campus. and they prevented him from speaking. It is hugely problematic. Part of the reason why you have to listen to views which you find repugnant, right? So let me give you the person who was actually Fleming Rose. Do you know who Fleming Rose is? He was the editor of the Danish newspaper who published cartoons of the Prophet ﷺ. Remember? And there was a huge outcry, as you might remember. So he was invited to be a speaker at the University of Cape Town. And a lot of students got together and decided, no, Fleming Rose should not be allowed to speak because Fleming Rose incited hatred and he published these cartoons. And I was asked to offer a response on it. And my position is exactly what I'm saying to you now. Fleming Rose has the right to speak. Fleming, I don't have to agree with Fleming Rose, but he does have the right to speak. When I allow somebody to speak, even when his views are completely and dichotomously opposite to mine, it provides me with the opportunity to engage with those views. So if somebody is a complete right-wing racist, and we have many of those, I have to listen to him. I need for him to express his racist views. That's when I can engage him. But if I say to him, I will not listen to you because I think you're an awful human being, he's simply going to go off with his views anyway. And it's going to kind of fester some more. So we have to get to a level of academic maturity. That's ultimately what it's about, where we are prepared to listen to views which are completely removed from what we hold dear. That is what academic freedom cannot be conditional. Yeah, thank you.
Question? Please.
So you talk about just women at the center of a lot of it, the center of change, the center of Islamophobia, and just how girls are taking the brunt of a lot of things that are happening, but also the ability to like change society and change the route. So I'm curious about how you would engage or how you respond to post-colonial thinkers like Janila Kudamuldi, who talks a lot about girls like being like, the ideal girl, right? And like the education sector really putting a burden and putting a lot of weight on girls as like this change agent for the rest of their their society. And we see that all the time within like Western media, like Malala, like how we've created this ideal Muslim girl.
Yeah.
And even so in education and how you imagine reimagining and returning, what does it actually look like to recognize the humanity of girls, recognize that like maybe some girls don't want to be the saviors of it, like, you know, like this like huge weight upon them in education. What does it look like for you, especially as you're looking at higher education and just education in general?
Yeah.
Especially with the messaging that a lot of education, like donors and like the sector is looking at specifically for Muslim girls.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, it's because of the historical treatment of women, and not just in Muslim societies, right? The idea of educating the girl it's not seen as a priority, right? In South Africa as well, you know, the girl child is seen to be at risk. She's the one who's going to drop out. She's the one who's going to take care of the younger siblings at home. She becomes the surrogate mother when the mother can't do things. So there's a huge risk factor for her. So I can't change the way the world has constructed that. But I hear your question in terms of saying, well, should we continue to burden her? Now, how I see that, and if I talk to you now from my talk here now in terms of a Muslim framework, is people don't believe me when I say to them that in Islam, women and men are actually completely equal. That whatever has been ordained for men is ordained for women. Whatever rights men have, women have. In fact, the men are not going to like this. In fact, I have more rights as a woman over the male than what he does over me. But the interpretation of that foundational text has been through a male imperative. Because the text we have used to interpret Islam has been through male scholars. And so the female voice has been sidelined and sidelined and sidelined until the interpretation becomes the norm and not the source code. So for me, the way forward, I don't have to change anything. I know where I stand. I'm above equal in terms of my paradigm. But in terms of Western democracies, it is a reality that females have not accessed education in the same way that males have. And we have to find a way to correct it. So yes, it can be seen as a burden, but I'm really hoping enough. And quite ironically, if you look at statistics at Muslim institutions, we're seeing a nice steady trajectory of more female students than males. So that's very encouraging for me. And I'm pretty sure that's going to tip in most countries. Okay. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. And I'm in harmony with most of what you've said, and not all. But I have a question on the Islamization piece of it. And I know you define, or at least you explain Islamization in a sense that this idea of combination of kind of what you could call secular knowledge and then the Islamic knowledge, and kind of the combination of both in a sense. I know the Malaysia, the Islamic University in Malaysia's model mainly was like a minor in Islamic studies, then you take if you're majoring in social science, you take a minor in Islamic studies, and if you're majoring in Islamic studies, you take a minor, and that kind of what Islamization meant at one point. But coming to it from the philosophy of education point of view. To your point that education has to have a purpose, and that's eventually, but even if it has the same or similar purpose, by definition, the different philosophies of education, mean that the approach to reach that objective or that goal or that purpose could be different.
Sure.
So if I would define Islamization to you as just encompassing the paradigm, call it Islamic ethical, moral, whatever you want to call it, but the few points that you've just pointed out, for example, like the embodiment of God's knowledge and what we know and the universe and that sort of things. And if the purpose of education is going from darkness or taking one from darkness to light and all of that, if I would package all of this and I agree with it. In a way where it becomes more of what I could call Islamic paradigm. And I look at you from an educational philosophy standpoint as my philosophy of education. Do you see anything wrong with that, if that's what you define or how you define Islamization?
I don't see anything wrong with that, provided that the education then becomes of benefit to all.
Right.
Yeah, so that the purpose of it does not become trapped in a paradigm,
right?
But is able to transcend that paradigm. Yeah, so I don't see harm in that. The problem that we have when we have to be careful about restricting ourselves to paradigmatic thinking, where we only think in terms of paradigms. We have to be able to navigate in an intersectional way and move across paradigms and take what we can so that we are able to speak to a wider audience, right? Because for example, I can't step into my university classroom and purport to want to teach from an Islamic philosophy. If I'm talking to a kind of diverse class, right? I have to be able to, and this is part of what Al-Ghazali, I think, taught us, is that you have to be able to cross over into other philosophies as well, because that's going to enrich.
But that's part of the paradigm
Yes,
itself,
that's, but
because you're supposed to accept diversity.
absolutely. But it's about being able to work from a paradigm, but then being able to cross over into other paradigms as well. Yeah. Thanks.
Could I just say,
Sure.
just in response to
Sure.
what you were saying about, changing, having some level of flexibility with the paradigm or with the philosophy, and that kind of brings up what we deal with in the field of Islamic psychology, and how something like a faith-based, whether psychotherapeutic approach or whatever, might have relevance to people that are outside of that faith. And I know that there are many psychologists who root their practice in the teachings of Islam, don't change the philosophy when they're working with non-Muslims. They change their language.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it kind of brings, this is kind of what I think
But-
about when you were talking earlier about language and
language.
using the philosophy,
Yeah. But the fact that they do that means that they have the language. And that's an important part of it. And that's why we are almost stuck in this vacuum at the moment, because we haven't acquired the language to respond to our modern day challenges. We keep on thinking that if we just turn inward, we'll be able to respond, but that's not happening for us. So we're not evolving as a community, and our higher education universities are not evolving either, because they haven't acquired that language.
Thank you, Nuraan, so much.